Hello, Huddlers. Today we're diving headfirst into the budgeting pressure cooker with Craig Moore, VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester. We know you all are being asked to hit aggressive growth targets with fewer people, tighter timelines, and in many cases, flat or shrinking budgets. I'm assuming this sounds familiar. Well, Craig has some fresh thinking on how to make all this work, and we're going to unpack it over the next 50 minutes. For those of you in the audience right now live with us, if you have questions, feel free to put them in chat or jump on camera by raising your hand. Okay, so Craig, one of the things we like to do in these is just in case the audience needs to leave early or we need to convince them to stay, what are three things you think CMOs are getting wrong when it comes to budgeting? If you can just list them, then we can unpack them together.
Sure. So number one is they create their budget architecture to look a lot like their organization chart. So it's a budget that gets allocated to maybe the marketing leadership team members, and they're each specialist in a discipline of marketing of some sort. And then the budget goes to them, and then they build their own plans, and that begins the big marketing silos.
Okay,
the next
that's
thing I'd
one.
say is they don't align their marketing plan to business objectives. So when they do
Okay.
that, essentially they're revamping the old calendar, lots of events usually, and a lot of focus on product launch. And then the third thing is that a lot of times marketing plans and marketing budgets consequently are developed around product orientation versus audience orientation. And the budget and the way you map your market segments are very related to each other. And if you really build your budgets around your product orientation, you begin to lose sight of the full customer lifecycle, and it makes it very hard to have a full lifecycle marketing relationship with your customers when you do it that way.
I love it. All right. Well, those are really meaty. Let's go through them one at a time. The budget should not equal the org chart. Let's go into that deeply and why that, first, what that looks like, and then why it's so problematic.
Well, think about a really well-defined strategic go-to-market plan, what we call campaigns. So we think of campaigns as these long-running activities that are focused on market segments and buyer needs. And if you want to build a campaign and you've got the money in marketing allocated to the different disciplines of marketing, like field marketing here and PR and events and all the different tactical things that you can execute from a marketing perspective, then when you want to really build a campaign that combines a whole set of these tactics or programs across the market segment over time, the money's allocated somewhere else. And so you end up with your campaign leaders, which are really running the strategic initiative that's there to try to drive revenue and retention around your market segments. They don't have the money. They have to go beg or tin cup for resources across the owners of the disciplines. But the problem is that most marketing leaders, they hire these experts in different disciplines of marketing, and they feel obligated to give them some power and control in the organization. They give them budget, and they do what they're experts at, which is to go off and build essentially their own marketing plans that are really around the disciplines of which they're expert. And so that creates this kind of tough situation where it's almost impossible to measure the ROI of marketing, and it immediately puts marketing on its back foot when it comes to having a strategic conversation with your counterparts in sales, product, CEO, finance.
Interesting. So, but breaking this down a bit, I've got a head of brand, I've got a head of demand gen, I've got a head of field marketing, and basically this problem begins when you say, okay, brand, you got X number of dollars, field, you got this. And so there's no coordination, there's no campaigns. These are in effect, they're already kind of shooting themselves in the foot, budgeting that way.
On that segmentation, yeah.
Right. And so the alternative of that is a campaign approach where we have this target with these objectives. We need multiple touches, multiple ways of going after that. We know it's going to involve field. We know it's going to involve some kind of brand overlay. And we know it's going to involve some kind of demand generation effort. So I wonder, though, is part of the problem just the org design?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the momentum of organizations. I'll say that, I've been preaching this architecture for budgets for a really long time. And, I'd say half of my clients kind of reject it out of hand because it just would be too hard to get it done in their organizations. It's not the way people feel empowered as marketing leaders, and it makes it difficult. And sometimes finance doesn't really know how to implement it that way either, because what you're essentially doing is funding an initiative instead of funding a discipline, and makes it's upside down a little bit for the way marketing and finance interact with each other. So we've had many clients that have adopted it. It's usually a transition. So they go from maybe phase one is to pull some of the money out of the discipline budgets and put it into the campaigns. And then, phase two is to put more of it over there and keep the disciplines on life support, but keep the budgets in the campaigns so that the campaigns can go and really respond to buyer needs and the segments that they're serving.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening right now, I would love to put in chat whether or not you are campaign based or department based, because I think that'd be a really interesting thing for us to see in the comments. And I'm glad you mentioned the phase approach, because I think that's probably one of the questions that folks, well, how do I get there and how do I unpack it? And even how do I recruit? If you say to the head of demand gen, you're part of the budget, you don't have a specific budget, it might be harder to recruit that person.
Might be. Depends on their perspective, but if you've
Right.
got a good, strong campaign team, maybe the thing to do is to bring them in to run campaigns.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and
again,
the people that we think the hot job in marketing is being the campaign leader. Now you call it a VP, director, whatever, but the person that's in charge of the campaign is then saying, here's the buyers, here's the segments, here's the proportion of investment I need to make in reputation, demand, engagement, enablement by segment. And then these are the kinds of programs that I want to execute over the long run. And in B2B, the sales cycles are 9, 12, 15, 18 months. So campaigns are running that long as well. That's the idea, is that campaigns run for the foreseeable future, not a quarter. And so when you have this longer term perspective and you put somebody that really knows how to get things done inside your organization, understands marketing, to direct the activities of the campaign, you get a different outcome.
It's funny, I wasn't prepared to advise everyone on this call and in listening to the podcast that they need to revise their organization. But it feels like if you want to fix your budget problem, you probably have to fix your organization a little bit and reorient. And what it really strikes me here is, if you take the campaign approach, you're also creating the long-term approach. You're also setting up the business value of what marketing does. Which I think is so important and so hard for folks to understand. And when you start to look at the budget and you say, oh, it's 80% demand gen and 50% field marketing and 20% brand, you're sort of looking as if those are separate things and that they don't work together. And we just know that's not true. All right. Let's get to the second one. I mean, I think we kind of covered it, but we're not aligning marketing spend with business objectives. Is there something else we should cover there to do that right? What's that look like?
Well, we have this notion of a plan on a page. And, the idea is that it's relatively straightforward, easy to communicate, and it aligns or it lists the primary business objectives, the ones that come from on high. What's the company trying to achieve? Is it revenue? Maybe it's some sort of brand recognition. Maybe it's position in a market segment. There's all kinds of different overall business objectives that the company's trying to achieve. And marketing needs to look at each of those objectives and figure out how it's going to support them. And so what you end up with as you build out your plan on a page is, a set of marketing plans that are aligned to different business challenges. And as you invest into each of those items in your marketing plan, you can begin to build the basis for understanding the return that you're getting on your investment. So being able to align to business objectives gives you the basis for the conversation to say, here is what marketing is doing to help the company achieve the objectives that it wants to achieve. So that way you get away from, well, look how many events we did, look how many attendees came to the event, look at, the readership of this content, all those activity kinds of things. I mean, that's interesting. And it's certainly interesting if, you're running the events and you're running them more efficiently, that's great. But it's not giving you the impact level perspective on what marketing is doing to help the company. And that's the trouble that CMOs get into, is that, and especially in B2B, right, is that product sales, they tend to be sort of in a lead role, and marketing is kind of, in a third role. And in order to be able to really sit at that strategy table with those other players, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're not a cost center, that you're driving the business and you're helping the business achieve its objectives. And so the way you do it is start with making sure that everything you do is lined up to the core business objectives.
And what's interesting, I think a lot of marketers believe that by putting the dollars in demand gen, they're doing that, right? And it's sort of ironic that yes, you do want to create demand. Yes, we understand that, but in order to do that, we live in a multi-touch environment, and that's what a campaign is. And if you reorient it that way, you've just elevated the business. You've elevated the role of marketing.
I think
Where
so, but if you look at the revenue picture for companies, like look, I mean, it's a startup and they're just getting their first few products out, then it's all demand, it's all net new buyers. But if it's a company that's been around for a while, chances are your revenue is made up of 60, 70, 80, 90% revenue from existing customers. So it's retention, it's upsell, it's cross sell. And the net new component is, what the demand budget is good for. And if you orient yourself towards saying that marketing equals demand, then you're kind of, you're missing the visibility into what your customer base looks like. Now, for some companies, it makes sense to have a really heavy demand-oriented budget. And I'll agree that it costs more to bring in a net new customer than it does to keep one. So for every, maybe $5 you spend on demand to bring in one customer, you spend $1 to keep one customer. So that's probably a true rate. I mean, that's not a benchmark number that's being quoted by Forrester right now, but the point is that it's more expensive to go get the net new customers, and your marketing plans really ought to consider that. So when you build a campaign, you ought to be looking at the market segments and breaking them down. How much of these are existing customers? How much are net new? And then you invest in different proportions of reputation, demand, and engagement for each of those new versus existing customer segments.
Okay, so the third one was plans, and sort of you talked about product. Typically, it's based on a product. We're going to spend X amount of
Yeah,
dollars to support this product, a new product, as opposed to audience and life cycle. Talk a little bit more in detail on
sure.
that one.
Well, a lot of the work that I've done in the years with Serious Decisions, and as Forrester's client base is a little more diverse than the technology clients that we saw at Sirius, but we still have this orientation in B2B where the product is the thing that we want to go take to market. And in many cases, you've got audiences with varied needs. The different audiences might have different, needs. They might articulate their needs a little differently, but they still need the same products. If I'm out talking about the feeds and speeds and capabilities and functionality of products, I'm sort of ignoring the fact that these customers have specific needs. They want those needs, presented to them in their language. And so being able to pivot from a product orientation to an audience orientation gives you a whole new perspective on how to work with your markets. So, markets, the segmentation that we advocate is really just go look at the different market segments that you're trying to identify, figure out what portfolio of your products map to each of those different segments, and then focus on the buyer needs. And I'll add one other point is, and
Sure.
I've seen this happen many times, is where marketers get really focused on almost imagining that they're steering the sale of the product by sort of these incremental steps in messaging that they're doing. And so this it's like remote control of selling the product. And in many cases, when you've got a direct sales force, marketing's job is to get the direct sales force to talk to the customer about their high level needs, and then over time begin to break down, well, which of the products are the most appropriate for that particular customer. Especially when you get into bigger, enterprise level sales, the opportunities are much more complex, and they buy a portfolio of products, not an individual one.
Okay. So, in summary, on this first part of this thing is, and I think we're talking about a radical transformation of how they look at their organization. in the sense that right now they orient their org chart looks at it a functional level as opposed to either a target level, right? Because if we did it on a we said, okay, you're small business or you are this type of customer, and we oriented that way, or we did it by campaign designed that way, you would have full alignment of spending and people. But right now, what you're saying, the biggest issue it feels like is there's not an alignment between how money is spent, and how the org is designed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a really interesting and provocative thing for all the CMOs to be thinking about is, are you budgeting by org chart? Number two was, are you budgeting by business objective? And number three, are you kind of budgeting by audience?
Yeah. Product versus audience.
Right,
Yeah.
versus product. And what's tricky there, and I want to just sort of wrap up on that one, is you've got a head of product marketing, they're excited about a new product. They want to know, hey, well, how much are you spending on my product? So
Right.
there's
Or they want a
pressure.
product campaign. Yeah.
Right. And so the challenge then becomes, how does a product campaign become a campaign, right? Because this is the product that we're going to do to help get us more traction in a particular audience, right? That's how we're going to make this pivot.
Well, think about a handful of campaigns, and maybe each of them have a slightly different portfolio of products that they represent. If you're the product owner in one of the P&Ls, you now, instead of looking for your product campaign, you're looking at the segment, the audience-oriented campaigns, and seeing where your products are featured. And in one, maybe a product launch is a really big deal because it's an important capability for that particular segment. In another, it might be a relatively minor milestone.
Right. And you really need to be able to distinguish between those two. This is a nice thing to talk about with existing clients because there's an upsell opportunity, or this is really going to open up the door to get us net new customers. Okay. So we've sort of outlined some really big picture things. Is there, when you look at 2026, and you've been doing this a while, are we doing anything different than we would have done in 2025?
Well, yeah, I think one thing is that, and this is what a lot of our budget planning research this year was about, is just looking at the volatility of the world and trying to think about how that can impact you as marketing leaders. In fact, I just made some notes on this, so let me make sure I get this right. Yeah, so we've got economic volatility, we've got geopolitical volatility, we've got supply chain volatility, and we've got legal volatility. Corruption, contracts are changing because terms that people are willing to sign up for and in relationships might be changing because people don't know what to expect. And so one of the big messages for planning your 2026 budgets is to really think about how volatility might affect you in the segments that you are in and the ones you might want to go in. And so we've provided some advice that is essentially, one's the opposite of the other. One is, focus on some of the segments that are stable and you can grow in, and be careful about the ones that, might be affected by tariffs, or they might be affected by, some of these exclusionary practices that are happening and sort of retaliation for some of the things that are going on. There's all kinds of different reasons to think about. There could be some supply chain problems where you might not be able to count on the supply chain that you need to be able to do the marketing and the selling that you want to, and that creates a lot of risk in those segments. So as you think about going into 26 and what you want to plan, really volatility is the thing hanging over your head. And the reason we got to this was we did a bunch of surveys, some data collection with CMOs and decision makers towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And we asked them about their optimism about their budgets. And we got back these hugely optimistic, results. It's, oh yeah, my budget's going to increase by so much, and blah blah blah. And it's like, I actually think that, or we collectively as analysts thought that, this is a little more optimistic than what we're actually seeing, especially in the first few months of this year, as we looked at some of the things that were happening and the tariffs that are sort of on and off and on and off, and everybody's bouncing back and forth between, is this going to affect my markets or not? And we felt like that optimism is, while we appreciate it and we kind of see marketers as generally optimistic people, they need to be a little careful about where they spend their money. You don't want to stick your neck out too far. And so that's that's why that one legal one kind of came to mind is the terms of, 2-year contracts might be harder to sign up for if you don't really know what's going to happen in 12 months. So those kinds of things really create a different planning environment.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's so interesting because, and we'll talk about AI later, but I know that a lot of CMOs, when they look at their MarTech and even investments there, they're looking at 1-year contracts, period, because they just know that there's so much disruption, and clearly that's happening on a broader scale. So yeah, this may be the era where if you can offer shorter term contracts, you are more likely to close. But I love this notion of stable and unstable, because it wouldn't be hard to look at, oh, we do business with in blue states that are applying government spending. Well, that could be a problem right now. So,
Yeah. You
uh,
see it in the newspaper, and
yeah,
it's
so
real.
you can get ahead of that. And again, it's putting your business hat on, not your marketing hat, and just thinking about and you're right, economics, supply chain, legal is all of those things are creating volatility. And unless you are in the literally in the AI space, you're feeling that. So, does that also mean that the CMOs need to be thinking about? So, notoriously, if you happen to have a line item called brand, that would be cut in the fourth quarter. That would be the easiest to cut. And so I'm just wondering, from a flexibility standpoint, given that do CMOs need to be thinking about their budgets as sort of, if everything goes well, we're here, and if it's not going as well because of the volatility, we're here, and build flexibility into their budgets?
Well, I don't think of brand as something you can turn on or off, and I think of the different, reputation being where brand sits, demand and customer engagement. Brand is one that really kind of moves the slowest and takes the longest to redirect that ship. So I don't think that's really an easy turn on, turn off kind of thing. Thought leadership initiatives and things like that. Um, I'm kind of losing the sight of your question there, but I think what we do in our planning, this plan on a page I mentioned, one of the outputs of one of the phases of the plan on a page process is to build a will do, will not do list. And I mean, I used to call it an is not list when I was product manager, and we would have a kind of prioritized view of it, and we would draw a cut line. And if you need to adjust your budget, somebody comes along, CFO, or circumstances change, you need to move things around, or salespeople, Eureka, if we need to do this, we need to go to this, we need some promotion around here. You can then go to that is not list, or that will do, will not do list, and kind of go to the bottom where your cut line is and say, well, which of these things do we move below the line so that we can move something else above the line? And then that gives you this prioritized notion of projects. So you're not hammering on fundamental marketing activities like how much demand do I do or how much reputation do I do, but maybe I've got projects that are defined that I can, move into some sort of prioritization. So part of the plan on a page process is literally a prioritization phase, and where you take all the things that are directly aligned to the business objectives, plus some of the other things that you need to invest in, like marketing enablement, teaching your own people how to do things. Maybe you want to do some research on personas and be able to understand what the characteristics are of the buying groups. I mean, those are research that don't produce revenue outputs, but it produces important information that you need to do better marketing down the road. So we think of looking at your stakeholders, usually executive team, sales, product, and then marketing itself, and then look at the time to impact or time to value for the different kinds of things you do. And as you get into these discussions about what do I need to to move off the will do list onto the will not do list, you can assess them in terms of time to impact and who's serving and the overall cost of the project that you might want to lift off. But it doesn't really do that much good to just thin out the butter on the bread. We've heard that metaphor many times, and while sometimes you can cut back on things, a few points or whatever, but you don't necessarily want to use that as a strategy for managing your budgets.
So I want to go back to make sure that I'm getting this. If we are in a sense allocating dollars by campaign, and Is that 100% of the dollars? Because I'm trying to figure out where does enablement and the research
Hmm.
and where does that fit into the budget structure?
So we think of campaigns, we think of our budget architecture. So we have this model called the strategic allocation model. And, we move personnel headcount off to the side because we don't view that as a highly volatile number. It's something that can change over time, but it's like a fixed asset almost. And you look at the program side of things, and within programs, we generally look for a 70-30 split between what's in campaign and what's out of campaign. And there are things that are out of campaign that might be shared services. It could be that your PR and your AR functions and things like that are funded out of there, and their program spend comes from that. You certainly would put your discretionary spend in there. Companies sometimes, like they have a big major event. The major event might be important to all of the campaigns they're running. So sometimes they'll call out yet another campaign, but sometimes they'll just stick it over and out of campaign and not try to chase the ROI on a big event like that. It's practically pretty hard to do. So the idea is to try to make life a little easier for you as CMOs and to give you the ability to detect and measure and document the ROI and the initiatives that you are running so that you can go have that conversation with your peers and executives about how marketing is contributing to the business. I mean, that's still the recurring theme in what we do here is to try to give you the opportunity to be more strategic as, the players and the leadership team for the organization and not get pushed into being perceived as a cost center. So the idea is to make sure that you can be a strategic player in the organization.
I'm just as you talked about programs versus headcount and parking headcount. In our first budgeting conversation this month, there was a pretty big range. If we take people, programs, and tech, and we break those out in terms of how much went into people versus, I mean, some were 60-70% people, some were only 40% people. It's a pretty big range in terms of that overall budget when you include programs and tech. Do you have a rule of thumb there?
Well, the numbers have changed over time and the way we collect the data has changed over time. So in 2012, I wrote the first true cost of marketing report for Serious Decisions, and I wrote it every 2 years through 2020. And then we had a little gap in time, and then we started collecting data a different way, and we started getting slightly different results. But for a long period of time, we looked at the balance of of programs and personnel, and then we had what we called outsourced services and tools and systems. And we were looking at, maybe 40-40 and then, 20 for the other categories. It could be 45-45-10, kind of depending on the size of the company. We'd see that, technology, you get a little bit more value out of technology as companies get larger and so forth. But 45%, I mean, these are rough numbers, right? As you look in the
Right.
different size organizations and so forth, then you're going to see some variations. One of the things that's changed lately, and I can't prove it, but I think this is happening, is that, and it's not that I can't prove it, I just haven't proven it yet, is that I think sometimes we look at technology today, and there's a lot of pay-as-you-use technology that's out there. I mean, look at intent, right? You can invest more and more and more in intent, marketing, like 6 Sense and things like that. And the more you spend, you could account for that as a tech spend, but in effect, it's really a program spend. And so what we're
Right.
asking people to think about is what's the baseline technology cost for having the capability or the ability to run an application like that? And then what are you spending on programs? So some of the data that we collect tends to show pretty high tech spend, but that's probably because the people that are responding are including what we would assess as program spend in their tech spend. So, I mean, I'm giving you a little bit of why the data is a bit confusing these days, but
No, I get it.
I think the reality
It's
is good.
No, I was just saying. So what you're really talking about is, so I'm in, say, I use 6 Sense, and then I'm spending a lot on programmatic advertising against that intent. Suddenly, that is a tech cost when it's really a program. It's just to
Yeah,
clarify, right?
yeah. Where you put the
So,
buckets.
right. So it's a hard rule of thumb, but I would think, and this may be a way of getting I think there's a lot of pressure right now on CMOs to get that people cost down under the guise that, yeah, we should be able to do more because of AI. And I'm just wondering if that's starting to show up in your data and you're seeing that happening.
Well, AI is a big change agent into marketing, and certainly it's going to affect a lot of things. My my goal, my perspective is that we want to help people use AI more effectively. May not, I mean, it's going to cost some, not necessarily jobs, although we know it's people are, getting replaced in different roles. But I think that more than anything, AI is going to start doing things that are repetitive and, very data intensive, but it's going to give the people that are doing those things today the opportunity to do something else and be more strategic in their role. So I'm a big believer in trying to shift some of the responsibilities of marketing to help marketers become more strategic. But that means that marketing has to invest in helping people understand how to use these tools in an effective way. And it's not that easy, right? Today you look at the, what AI is. I might listen to one of your podcasts from a couple of weeks or maybe a month or so ago, and you're talking about agentic, and nobody really knows what the definition of agentic AI is. And it's because it's kind of made up and defined by people that are selling products and as well as people that are using it, and they don't all have the same set of definitions. So if you're trying to figure out where AI fits in your organization, I think it's a real confusing mess today, and as to where it might fit in and how it can be used and how it can be applied to optimize your organization. So I've been doing some work on thinking about how a CMO can address because they're getting a lot of pressure to use AI. People, what you just said is, hey, AI ought to reduce costs, so go use AI. And so what I'm beginning to come around to is that we ought to be evaluating the big processes that cut across marketing and
Right.
breaking them down into the parts of which they are comprised, and then look at AI and don't assume AI is just generative AI, because it's not, right? You've got predictive, prescriptive, you've got all kinds of tools that are AI enabled today and you've probably already got them in your tech stack. So it doesn't mean you have to run out and buy brand new, generative AI tools to use AI today, but you can look at the steps in all the different processes and then think about some criteria for which version or type of AI is the most appropriate for the problems you're trying to solve. And so it's just, I think one of the classic thoughts are that if you've got a really big problem in front of you, you need to break it down into smaller problems so that you begin to solve it. And I think the same thing's true with where do I use AI? I mean, certainly you can find a few use cases, and there's vendors out there that'll say, look how you can, write this content, or look how you can do this other thing. But I think from a CMO's point of view, you need to kind of back out and look at, well, what is my organization doing from a kind of product management or product marketing processes do I have? What kind of campaign planning and implementation processes do I have? What sort of marketing planning and budgeting processes do I have? And there's others. How do I break those down to figure out where different forms of AI can work? And you might find that prescriptive AI, maybe with a little agentic capability, so that it sees what ought to change and then it can actually implement the changes. I mean, those kinds of things can work today. You just have to understand the scope of where it can fit in. So, I mean, to sort of answer your question, I think AI is going to really transform organizations. I don't know if I really believe it's going to reduce cost, because I mean, I've been working out of college for a really long time, and every time a new innovation comes along, it's not like my life got easier. It's more stuff gets done,
Right.
but I'm still working as hard as I ever did. So I think that we still have jobs as marketers. I think that we just have to figure out how to use this new family of tools to make our organizations more effective.
A couple of thoughts on that. Yeah, I mean, everyone in our community is using it for content and they're finding efficiencies, and they might have one less copywriter now because of it, but they're also being able to do iteration after iteration that they weren't able to do before. So in theory, they're helping marketing be more effective. They're getting closer to working on workflows and solving that. In order to solve the workflow or processes you described it, you need like what we call an AI ops person who can create that and solve that. So now you've actually added a
Plus one
person.
headcount. They're
Yeah, and I think
making,
that's happening already is that where
yeah,
somebody's volunteering. So there's an irony, but I want to sort of connect two dots because you and I before the call said zero-based planning is silly. It's a stupid notion. We can talk about that for a second, but I have noticed this, and this is something that the AI advocates of. If you are a small company starting out, you're looking at what you can do very differently than a company that already has 20 or 50 or 100 employees. And so there is a moment, like if you were running a startup, you'd probably say, I don't need the same organizational structure that I did before because these tools can do so much more. And that's a mindset that I think is very hard for CMOs who have 50 or 100 or say 500. You are going to look at it because you have all these people and these are people's lives and you brought them in and all of that. But if you were starting out, you would look at it totally differently.
I agree. I mean, I can tell you in my work, I don't really work with people with organizations that don't have a past. It's like the last thing they're going to do in day one in a startup is budget, Forrester. I mean,
Right.
that comes later, right? When you've got a product and you want to get a wave or, you want some advice. So you're a few years down the road, but before you start bringing in people like me to help with best practices. So I don't really get to see what, the big bang looks like for some of these companies, but I can tell you that for companies that are, 100 million and on up
Right.
and, the kinds of problems that they're having and trying to deal with, I mean, they generally have last year's budget. They have some tech stack of some sort. They have some set of processes that they use. It might be distorted in terms of their demand component. They're trying to introduce some reputation or brand components, and those are the kinds of things that we can begin to address. But most tiny companies are one or two people. They're running around with their hair on fire most of the time, trying to get products to launch and then sold. And product marketing for the sake of products at that point is probably okay because you've got one product and or two products, and what do you have but speeds and feeds, and you're looking for likely buyers. So
Um,
it's a different world.
Okay, so getting back to budget, it's so some companies finance gives the marketer a template for the budget. Have you found that there's any advantage? Is a way of giving them a couple of versions or helping them see because CFOs have a very specific perspective on things, and
Yeah.
and so how do you advise CMOs when they get this template? Is it create a couple of versions or what?
Well, the financial systems designed them, 40 years ago, right? The general ledger concept. And if you go look at a lot of these systems that are in place, and, before I became an analyst, I was in the middle of this with, big multi-billion-dollar company where we had a big financial system and they had four line items for marketing. I think there were something like advertising, travel, events, and something else, right? And
Right.
and, and that's not how we do marketing, right? I mean, those are interesting categories from a budgetary perspective, but it has absolutely no relationship to what we're trying to do from a marketing perspective. And we went through cycles of saying, well, do we need to be product oriented or geographically oriented, or and eventually we came around to recognize that the best way that it seemed to work was to really be audience oriented. And so what we had to do is to develop this translation between how finance was thinking about the budget and how marketing was thinking about the budget. It's like an API between the two organizations. And what you really need is a companion in the finance organization, a controller that is willing to work with you and trust you that you're going to manage your budget effectively. And then, and I have this big spreadsheet that I share with clients. I literally had this conversation with a client last, let's see, Wednesday night. Somebody in a big company in Japan was going through the same thing. How do we pivot out of accounting, sort of determining what our budget looks like, into something that is more marketing oriented? Because they felt like the concepts we were laying out made sense, but they had no idea how to do it. And they started with, well, if everything's got a project code, or a cost center number, then how do I do it? And some of that stuff you have to sort of blow up a little bit by swizzling, and creating a conversion between cost centers and what you're going to do with the money. So, and the bigger the company, the more complex it is. So, but if you are sitting here from a big company, I mean, we've worked with the likes of SAP and IBM and companies like that, help them sort out, these kinds of challenges. So, they're big, they're complex, they've got these massive, well-entrenched systems, but they can make the pivots. So it's possible to do it even if it looks complex.
Right. So, I mean, first thing that CMOs need to understand is what are those buckets that are in finance? Because now then you're going to have to translate that out to the way you spend your money or want to spend your money, and then translate that to the outcomes that you want so that they can understand that. In an ideal world, if you're doing your budgeting right and you're spending right, the CFO recognizes that marketing is a lever that they can pull. Is that a fair, right? That they understand this is an investment lever. And there's always stories almost every year. Well, CFO just said, hey, I got an extra $1 million sitting here. What would you do with it? Which
Yeah.
is kind of ironic, and that's a fun moment, but they often struggle with that as well.
Well, if you can't do that, you need to figure out how. And one of the tools we've developed is like it manages, like you can align essentially waterfalls across each of the segments you're targeting. And if you apply the cost elements of what it takes to win deals through the waterfall or retain deals through the waterfall, then if you can apply more or less budget to it, so you can begin to do some. If I had an extra $1 million, here's where I'd put it. So you can begin to do that, but you got to be ready for it. And
And
so they
is
just
it,
show up, and you're just you got this budget that's organized like your org chart, and it's like, well, what am I going to do? Go to some more events or give some more money to PR? And how does that translate to the business objectives? It doesn't.
right? Right, because once again, you're stuck in the silos. You got to give that
Yeah,
money to somebody to spend it. Oh, we'll spend more on PR. That's not what we're talking about.
yeah.
So going back though, the math here is cost per acquisition over lifetime value or something, or what is that? So that if we know that it costs us $10,000 to acquire an enterprise customer, then we need to be able to say, well, we could spend $1 million, which would be help us get to X number more customers. Is that the idea?
Well, that's the idea. I mean, it's not necessarily a linear equation, but you can use some common sense to say I can bump it a little bit. I mean, if you go 10 to 1, then you're probably maybe projecting in places where you'll hit diminishing returns. But if you're going to make some adjustments, if the CFO comes to you with an extra $1 million, it's probably an extra $1 million on top of 10 or 20 that you're already spending. So it's a 5 to 10% increase, not a 1,000% increase. So you can project forward like that. You should be able to, and you should also be able to try to balance it. Just kind of come back to the same old song, which is it's not just demand. You've got existing customers. You want to engage with your customers and try to drive retention, upsell, and cross sell. And if you think about the math of retention, if your retention rate isn't awesome, I mean, if it's 75%, 80%, that means that you've got to make up, let's say it's 80%, you got to make up 20% to break even
Right.
with net new buyers, and now you just caught up with yourself. And then you got to go on top of that. And you probably have growth rates in your company. So if you do the math and let's kind of plot it out year over year, and I know because I've done this, I've got a research report on it's called Terrified of Retention. You can begin to see how you're going to hit this wall somewhere along the line if you're not keeping track of your retention rates. So one of the things that you ought to be doing as a marketing leader is really understanding your retention rates and what you can do to get them maximized so that you get more out of your demand activities.
Is one of the strategies, so, and gets tricky, but I like to encourage CMOs to have a budget for experimentation and pilots of say 5 to 10% of the budget, so that those pilots are going on and the CFO does come running. Hey, this pilot is really working. And by the way, the pilot is developed with the CFO to so they can see the potential ROI along the way. Is that something that you all prescribe to?
Sure.
Recommend?
This notion of out of campaign should contain some discretionary money for things that come up. You used the example of pilots. Sometimes it's like an acquisition happens or something that you hadn't anticipated just pops up and you want to go invest in that. You definitely need to have some resources sitting nearby. Challenges in a public company where you do reconciliation on a quarterly basis, that money usually has to be spent by the end of the quarter because it just doesn't automatically roll into the next quarter. If you're private business, maybe it's a different story. But for public companies, they have to manage that really carefully, and it becomes cumbersome. So you have to be careful. You don't want to have too big of a CMO pot because then they have to spend it, and all of a sudden everybody's running around the last 3 weeks trying to waste money, kind of like the government does. And but absolutely, I believe that you should be experimenting. And in our budget guide for this year, we did lay out, we had invest, divest, and experiment. So three areas to try new activities. And AI is a part of that experimentation. That's a great place to go get some knowledge, and maybe even invest in some of your enablement there. I mean, I would say that we're at the point where we need to just go ahead and dedicate resources and not make it an experiment to help our people learn more about how to use AI effectively. Once you train them, they're going to have ideas, and then you'll get a seeding ground for better ways to do it. But we could also put some into your experimental budget.
So invest, divest, and experiment. So
Right.
invest, is there something that you think that CMOs are under investing in and should be investing in 2026?
Well, we kind of ran down that. I'm just looking at the report here on my left. One is we think that relative targeting is a really important capability, and it kind of goes back to our discussion around audience frameworks, audience segmentation. But if you're not doing it on a regular basis and really understanding how to weigh the opportunities across different market segments, then you're not going to be able to evolve as the environment changes. And we've just been thrust into this, volatility environment where relative targeting becomes even more important. So that was our first one this year. We think that moving into more of we call revenue process transformation. A lot of companies are structured to think about demand, and that's marketing. And, thinking about the entire customer life cycle is really critical. So if you're kind of overweighted towards just thinking of marketing as landing the net new customers and then, hope they stay, maybe there's an opportunity to be more deliberate about, what do you do? Maybe you segment a little differently so that you've got new and existing, and you have different marketing programs for your existing customers. And so if you're not doing that already, then that's a place that you ought to be investing.
Okay, and divest?
Well, so the opposite of these, going into stable markets, one of them is get out of the ones you think are going to be troublesome. You
Right.
probably in the last couple of years, might have some new areas that, could be touched. I mean, you kind of brought it up yourself, this blue state, red state, government investment kind of stuff. I mean, that's like right there on the front page. And it's like, wow, if I was a marketer and that was my customer base, I would be very concerned, and I'd want to de-risk that one. So, I mean, that's an
Right.
easy one to pick, but there's other kinds of things like that. Just by understanding your segments really well, you can begin to figure out where to get the heck out of. We also see a lot of spray and pray. Let's just execute a bunch of marketing tactics, go to these events, but they're not connected to a set of objectives towards, what I consider to be a campaign. And so that's kind of a call to take more of an integrated campaign architecture and mindset to how you do your marketing planning. So, try to make sure that everything you're doing and when you build your marketing plans are aligned towards business objectives and are segmented appropriately in the campaign architecture. So spray and pray, you see it all the time. I mean, there's a bunch of marketers out here. I'm sure all of you have seen organizations sort of hit this tactical treadmill where you're just running one marketing tactic after another, and you've lost the ability to understand where you hit diminishing returns, or if you have, and maybe your problems are more concerned about efficiency and traffic management than trying to figure out whether they're achieving the business goals you're trying to achieve. And that's usually a sign that you're spraying and praying.
So, all right, we're going to get rid of that as a budgeting habit. We're running out of time, and I have more questions for you. So let's just fast forward to 2027. I mean, successful CMOs will look at their budget and go, damn, I did that right. What were two things they did correctly and one thing they stopped doing?
Oh yeah, let's see. Well, I think this is, I kind of made notes on this thing. I appreciate you giving me the outline of your questions beforehand. I think one of them so two do's and a don't, is that where we are
Sure.
here? So
Yep.
yeah, so we are we are asking you to adopt this notion of revenue process transformation. Now, those are our words, but essentially it's like get out of this demand cycle, thinking about just demand is what marketing is all about, and recognize that there's a long-term relationship with your customers and invest in reputation, demand, engagement, and enablement. And when I say enablement there, I'm thinking about enabling the sales force, enabling your third-party selling partners, enabling them on the themes, the needs of the buyers, and helping them understand what this campaign architecture is all about, so that they know how to use the assets, convey the messages, and help customers understand the value of what it is that you're trying to sell. But the bigger picture is it's reputation, it's demand, and it's engagement. So that's like one of the major do's. We think that just doing a rigorous job of segmentation is important, and it's really hard. And I know it's hard because I spent a lot of time in workshops with clients trying to figure out what their segmentation is, because you get this thing we call the combinatoric problem, where you start going by maybe there's a first level of segmentation that's maybe it's large, medium, small. And then you start adding in industries. You got healthcare and insurance or financial services and manufacturing and all of these. And then you might have some other, like maybe solution-oriented segmentation or new versus existing, and you start multiplying all these to each other, and you get to 36 pretty fast. Now you got all these segments, and how are you going to deal with 36 segments in a unique way? And then, so what you have to do is kind of go through another process of trying to find commonalities between the segments, which may not be obvious when you started this project, to try to reduce the number of segments that go on. So my point here is that being able to do good segmentation is a little bit of art, it's a little bit of science, takes some time, and you need to use a lot of judgment and get the smart people in the room to think about where you can begin to consolidate. I've seen some brilliant jobs done in the segmentation activities. One of our clients is Siemens Digital Systems. They were able to, they cracked the code with new versus existing, where they found that all of their industry-oriented messaging needed to go to net new. And then once they landed the customers are already comfortable with Siemens in that industry, so they didn't need to spend so much time doing industry speak. It was more product speak, promotion speak, upgrades, and those kinds of things. So that was a very effective, kind of very high level view of their segmentation strategy. But those kinds of things you can get to, but it takes a while to break it all apart before you finally get there.
Okay, and then one don't.
Right. So stop assuming that marketing is mostly demand.
All right.
It's not.
It's not. It's not.
It
Unless you're
really
at a
isn't.
startup, in which case, knock yourself out. All right.
Yeah.
Well, Craig, really appreciate your input. Lots of food for thought for folks to digest. I look forward to going back through the transcript and actually helping me digest some of this. So really appreciate you being here. People can find you, obviously, here all over
LinkedIn,
LinkedIn.
Forrester.
And if any folks have any questions, can we filter them and send them to you as a follow-up?
Sure.
Awesome.
That'd be great.
All right.
And connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like.